Today I've got a ton of content all about one of the most interesting aspects of the Star Wars universe, the criminal underworld. As always, if there's a topic you don't find interesting, use timestamps in the description to skip around, but let's get this started. How did Hutts, creatures so obese it's expected that he'll be carried around, gain such a secure hold on power in the galaxy? Like in the Book of Boba Fett, could the slaves not simply have dropped the Hutt siblings? Let's talk about that. The first thing to point out is the level of incredible obesity achieved by Jabba is not the natural state of the Hutt species. In their natural state, Hutts are fairly muscular, they can move quickly even through the difficult swamplands of Nal Hutta. They're imposing physically and their tail itself can be a dangerous weapon. One famous example of a more fit Hutt was Beldorian. He was actually a Jedi for the Order, and was probably a level of strength and mobility actually beyond most Hutts. Hutts were also naturally very long-lived and could grow to be over 1,000 years old. So all of that I think does help justify the presence of so many Hutt crime families, but it doesn't fully explain the degree to which they've dominated the criminal underworld and the fact that they are now able to allow themselves through decadence and laziness to gain so much weight and generally achieve the more standard Hutt-like physique that we're familiar with. The true threat of dominance can actually be tracked back, according to the Essential Guide to Warfare, 25,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. The Hutts, after suffering a terrible civil war, decided that rather than direct conquest or action, they would be better served by manipulating what they considered to be lesser races. The Hutts would still engage in war in this early period, and it's even said that they had special machines that they placed their bodies in so they'd be more mobile and dangerous on the battlefield. However, they also dominated many less sophisticated species and took them in as slaves. Some of these early enslaved species still serve under the Hutts, including the Nikto and the Klatooinian. Even before the shift away from direct conflict, the Hutts had still been using slaves. And in 25,000 BBY, the Hutt slave empire was even able to defeat Zim the Despot in battle through sheer numbers, and eventually the Hutts gained dominance in their portion of space. They kept their slave species in check through brutal oppression, including the bombing and poisoning of a species' homeworld. Slave-crewed ships allowed the Hutts to aggressively and recklessly attack any who stood against them, and eventually they established a territory of space. Well, even the Republic was still fairly young. Perhaps it was the natural longevity of the Hutts which allowed them to remain successful for so long, but as the Republic flourished, the Hutts expanded from slavery and piracy to other forms of trade and commerce, both legitimate and illegitimate. For one, Hutt territory was fairly large and well situated. The Hutts would charge a fee for any trade that went through that area of space. They also ran protection rackets where they would sell guardianship services to trade ships and retaliate if their protection, and thus payment, was refused. The Essential Guide to Warfare states that refusing Hutt protection would mean you'd get a visit from strange-looking alien ships, alluding to the fact that at this point, the Hutts were still managing a vast cadre of client species. The Hutts did their best to avoid open warfare, but they didn't always do so successfully. They were the subject to, for example, the Pius Deus Crusades of the Republic, but were able to weather that storm for reasons I might have to break down in a future video. The Hutts generally were guided by the Khajiitic philosophy, which emphasized personal wealth and the superiority of the Hutts. As the Republic expanded, waxed, and waned, the Hutts were generally happy to maintain simply sometimes economic control over planets, even when the Republic staked a formal claim. So now most of this information has been Star Wars Legends based, but presumably it will apply to canon as well. If we go to, say, the Book of Boba Fett, the Hutts are still maintaining power over their cartel through incredible political and economic power. Now, Star Wars canon has dealt many blows to the Hutts after the Battle of Endor, which are kind of outside the scope of today's video, but this power makes up for the physical weakness that Hutts are now suffering. Could you kill any one individual Hutt? I mean, probably yes, but Hutt family bonds are strong, the species bonds are strong as well, so while you won't see direct retaliation from the Hutt physically, like the Hutt's not going to slug himself over and hit you, they've got unimaginable resources to do that, which is why Han Solo's life was so difficult for a while. The source of this power is very old, 25,000 years, but that's where it comes from. The Hutts, despite being, well, pretty funny looking, are an incredibly dangerous and well-established race in the Star Wars galaxy, and one that's been run exceptionally well, even compared to, say, the Republic. By 43 years after the Battle of Yavin, a bunch of things had went very, very wrong in the Star Wars galaxy. Sure, the Galactic Civil War had ended with peace between the Empire and the New Republic formed, but the galaxy had also been attacked by extragalactic invaders and suffered a second Galactic Civil War, which almost saw the Galactic Federation of Free Alliances torn apart. However, of course, that was not the end of things. Fate of the Jedi, which is the final major book arc of Star Wars Legends, sees several new threats emerge, including Abeloth, a Lovecraftian nightmare trapped within the Maw, who has caused almost an entire generation of Jedi to go insane. More on that in a later video. However, along with Abeloth, we also see the reappearance of the Lost Tribe of the Sith. So, for some very, very brief backstory, about 5,000 years before the events we're talking about today, as the Sith Lord Naga Sadow was planning a war against the galaxy, the Sith dreadnought Omen crashed on the planet Kesh. Over 5,000 years, the surviving Sith mingled with the native Kashiri, essentially building a civilization across the planet. However, even with the crash of the Omen, the Lost Tribe was unable to make spacefaring vehicles. Still, the Sith remained practiced in their ways, and by the modern era had created a new generation of Force users, albeit again, ones stranded on Kesh. This had all changed by the Second Galactic Civil War and the rediscovery of the Sith meditation sphere known as Ship. Through a variety of happenings, which I'll cover in a later video, Ship made his way to the Lost Tribe of the Sith and connected them to the outer galaxy, because the Sith had not only been marooned, they had been completely out of contact with anyone outside of their planet. They were surprised to learn that Sith were not actually ruling the galaxy, and were nearly extinct, with Jedi now holding all of the power. Ship gave the Sith a way off-world, and the Lost Tribe slowly began capturing freighters and small capital ships, building up a ragtag fleet. Now, that's the basic backstory. Anyway, the Lost Tribe of the Sith launched an attack against Luke Skywalker. All were eventually killed besides Vistara Kai. Eventually, Kai, Skywalker, and the Sith discover that they have a common enemy, the dark being known as Abeloth. Abeloth's true nature was unknown to both parties, although they had guessed that she was extremely old and very, very powerful. I promise now we're getting closer to the point of today's video. Anyway, a formal truce is made between the Sith and the Jedi, and they decide to travel to Sinkhole Station, which is actually within the Maw itself. Although a single ship, like the Jade Shadow, could travel to that location with the entire fleet, Luke decides that they need a specialized vessel with many state-of-the-art tractor beams, so he calls Lando, who tells them to meet at Klaatuine. Klaatuine is unsurprisingly home to the Klaatuinians. Now, what's interesting about this species is they had lived as quasi-slaves to the Hutts for almost 25,000 years. They were one of the oldest continuous civilizations in the galaxy, but the entire time had been under the thumb of the Hutts. And this is where the Sith admiration comes in. So, the Lost Tribe of the Sith was really concerned with beauty and aesthetics, so when High Lord Talon initially sees the Hutts, he thinks they are completely disgusting, and who can blame him? However, when he learns about their continuous domination of a species for 25,000 years, he can't help but be impressed. The Lost Tribe of the Sith had been missing for 5,000 years, which seems like a long time, but in comparison, the Hutt rule is basically forever. They aren't just some new little faction thriving in a power vacuum. No, the Hutts were powerful when the Sith were. And had the Lost Tribe of the Sith not been isolated so long, thus forgetting the state of the galaxy, this probably would have been recognized outright. But it's more than this. The Sith obviously valued dominating lesser beings. The Hutts presented themselves as quasi-gods to the Klaatuinians, and were successful in doing so, something made even more impressive by their strange appearance, I think. The Hutts were self-serving, they used intelligence, and they used manipulation to take advantage of a lesser species. They took Klaatuinian children and used them in their militaries, they took resources, they mined the planet. To a Sith, it's all very, very impressive. But what's more, the planet Klaatuine itself had a beautiful natural formation known as the Fountain of Ancients preserved on the planet, and I think the fact that the Hutts recognized its value also elevated their standing to the lost tribe of the Sith. Interestingly though, this all happened at a time when the Hutts were perhaps the weakest they'd ever been. The species' Outer Rim holdings were pretty badly mangled during the Yuuzhan Vong War, where they suffered from some double crosses, and had many of their worlds Vong formed. They had also not been treated kindly by the Second Galactic Civil War, where their fleets had been pawns of the Confederacy and the Galactic Federation. Klaatuine was still technically under Hutt control, but only so because the Klaatuinians were very loyal and did not want to rise up against a contract that they had willingly signed, even if it was 25,000 years ago. When the topic of battle droids or battle droid armies comes up, most people, when talking about Star Wars, think of the Confederacy of Independent Systems and their many trillions of droids fielded during the Clone Wars. While that army was good, it never quite dominated, and the droids didn't push the army to the next level, unlike the creations we're about to discuss. Zim the Despot was one of the greatest warlords in galactic history, creating an empire over 25,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. Zim brutally violated, sacked, and conquered worlds across the galaxy, acquiring unimaginable wealth. During his war against the Hutts, Zim's military, however, took on a bold new form, an army of special troopers made up of gigantic 3-meter tall war robots. Although incredibly ancient by modern standards, Zim's droids were powered by an even more ancient force, the Rakata. Allegedly, the most advanced models of Zim's droids were augmented by Force-imbued technologies, far increasing their capabilities and allowing them to devastate enemies with their thick armor, heat beams, particle weapons, and pulse wave blasters. However, even standard droids use reverse-engineered Rakatan technology, and this gave them several edges. The key one was probably intelligence. Although, again, the droids were ancient by modern Star Wars standards and lacked the true intelligence of something like C-3PO or even a super battle droid, the Essential Guide to Warfare states that, unlike prior droid models, they had, at the very least, a glimmer of intelligence. That being said, during battle, they very rigidly and literally interpreted their orders, which were usually dispensed remotely by an organic commander. Still, the extra intelligence would have made the droids just overall more effective workers. Zim's war droids were very large and bulky. Though they were quite difficult to destroy, they were also very slow, heavily armored almost everywhere. These aren't like armored humanoid soldiers, they're more like walking tanks. Unfortunately, well, not really for the rest of the Star Wars universe, but for the army at least, Zim was captured and eventually died under the Hutts. Many of his droids afterwards, which were produced on a much more limited run than later droid armies, were then destroyed by the Hutts at the Third Battle of Vontor. With Zim dead and no more droids being actively produced, the Essential Guide to Warfare explains that the remaining units were handed down among ancient families as bodyguards, while others were stationed on long-lost outposts of the Despot's empire. At least 2 of these hidden caches saw action during the modern Star Wars era. During the early Galactic Civil War, 1,000 of Zim's robots, a brigade known as the Guardian Corps, was accidentally activated, destroying the miners on the planet Dalat, as we see in Han Solo and The Lost Legacy, though most of those were eventually destroyed when a bridge collapsed under their weight. Despite being over 25,000 years old and unused for almost that entire time, the war droids operated perfectly, showing no signs of aging, speaking to the quality of their creation as well as the incredible and mysterious Rakatan technology that helped to power them. Another group of droids had, well, a bit more fun of a final stand. The Hutts seized some of Zim's remaining droids after the Battle of Vontor and brought them back to their home space. During the Yuuzhan Vong War, as the Vong betrayed the Hutts, who had been working with them prior to that, and moved into Hutt territory, many of Zim's droids were reactivated and managed to kill thousands of Vong warriors before being destroyed. This is not unlike the squadron of B2s who also fought the Vong in a video which I'll link above. Again, that's 25,000 years of biding their time, and they still devastated Vong warriors, which were nearly unequaled in strength and combat skill. This also makes me wonder how Zim's droids would have done against Lando's YVHs. YVHs probably had better armor and tactics, just given to the time of their design, but Zim's droids probably make up for some of that by being much larger. I think overall the YVHs would probably be better against single high skill opponents or in tight spaces like starships, but that Zim's droids would still have their uses as well, especially in large battles. Star Wars Legends has lots of interesting examples of species that, due to their biology, can affect the Force in some way. The most famous example would be the Islamari of Murker. Their mere presence created a bubble through which the Force could not operate, and if you got multiple Islamari together, the bubble became larger and larger, sometimes spreading over kilometers. Another example would be the spook crystals of Nom Chorios. They were a sort of sentient mineral and not only communicated through the Force, but also amplified it. Another example of a species with a strange biological connection to the Force would be the Yuuzhan Vong, who, on a species-wide level, actually had the Force stripped from them. More on that in a later video. Today though, I want to talk about mind control and species-wide immunity. Now, while it is true that certain mental toughness and what's usually categorized as a strength of will can be a defense against mind control, certain beings like Hutts or Yinchori are, if not incapable of being mind controlled, at least highly resistant. The first person that we know of who actually dug deep into this was Darth Plagueis, who operates as sort of a Sith scientist. He was very interested in not only permanently extending his life, but also the mechanics of how midichlorians worked, how Force connection worked, and just the genetic aspects of the Force. Unsurprisingly, Plagueis took a great interest in the Yinchori, and after working with the people, was able to secure a prisoner which he could experiment on his secret island. That island, by the way, held dozens of species which he experimented on freely, testing, and I quote, volition, telepathy, healing, regeneration, and life extension, with some promising results. He discovered that when it comes to the Yinchori, and I quote, unlike Islamari, which created a Force bubble in the presence of danger, the Yinchori were in a perpetual state of involuntary immunity to Force suggestion. So it's not just the fact that they have a specific brain structure, which makes Force coercion difficult, it's actually a property of their midichlorians. And specifically, Plagueis guesses that the Yinchori's midichlorians evolved that way to provide protection from some powerful Force-sensitive beings. And this is actually very similar to Islamari. It appears that their Force bubble creation evolved as a way to protect against Vornskurs, which were a Force-sensing creature who preyed on them on Murker. Plagueis goes so far as saying immunity to a Force suggestion like that seen in the Hutts, Toydarians, and others like the Yinchori was hardwired into them because of some past threat to the survival of the species. And that's the basics. All of these creatures most likely had some common enemy. The question is, well, whom? One thought that I had almost immediately, and I think an interesting one, was the Rakata. We know that the Rakata was an extremely dominant ancient galactic civilization, and that their weapons were powered with the Force itself. We know at the very least that the Hutt home planet was under control of the Rakatans and that they managed to seize Rakatan technology, so perhaps a subgroup of Hutts evolved, or the entire species did. It's hard to say. It could also have to do with some interaction between the early Jedi, or maybe even the Celestials, or perhaps, if it's possible, some even older and greater entity. Anyway, returning back from speculation, we know that one of the reasons Plagueis was interested in this science had to do with totally controlling beings, and specifically controlling them through their midichlorians. Plagueis wanted to learn how to, and I quote, persuade, prompt, cajole, and coax them into action. Part of that was for use on others, but he also wanted to gain ultimate control over his own midichlorians because he thought that was the ultimate tool to everlasting life. And whenever Plagueis killed somebody, he would actually observe their death to see how their midichlorians reacted. But as I mentioned, he also wanted to control other beings. He was able to break the mind resistance of the Inshori, but he figured at some point he would be able to totally compel action of those he wished, or totally alter their personality, to, and I quote, one day influence the leaders of worlds and systems to act according to his designs. And in a bit of foreshadowing, he also thought he might be able to manipulate midichlorians to produce forceful beings. One final fact is that Inshori, because of their resistance to mind control, were considered by Plagueis as a template for the Republic's clone army, with the knowledge that they would eventually be destroying the Jedi. The main issue though was that the species was a bit too violent and unpredictable. Now, when I say criminal organizations, I'm not necessarily referring only to gangsters or thugs, but anyone doing anything illegal. This caveat applies mostly to the organization in the number 5 spot on this list, but we'll discuss more when we get there. In ranking these 5 organizations, I've looked at various factors, including resources, longevity, total members, the degree to which the organization is integrated into the galaxy's economy, and really, I guess, just notoriety. Coming in at number 5 is the Smugglers Alliance. Now, smuggling wasn't inherently a negative thing, and in reality, the Smugglers Alliance was often crucial to the various efforts of the New Republic. Largely because of that, I suppose, the Smugglers Alliance were able to operate illegally in certain areas of the galaxy, unmolested by the New Republic. Well, what's illegal about smuggling, you may be wondering? There are several things. Smuggling is often used to transport illegal items, whether illegal in the entire galaxy or restricted on a certain world. It's also used to bypass taxes and other regulations, and the main goal is to avoid the various laws and authorities put in place to regulate the movement of goods. So, by logic, smuggling is illegal, and the Smugglers Alliance was technically a criminal organization. However, again, as I stated, they were a positive force in the galaxy. After the death of Jabba the Hutt, there was an opening for new organizations to step up and fill the demand for smuggling and other activities that the Hutt had been provided. Talon Karrde stepped in, filled this void, and very quickly rose to extreme prominence within the galaxy. During the Thrawn Crisis, Karrde reached out to many other smuggling groups within the galaxy, organizing the Alliance as a way to give them all a unified voice. In turn, the Alliance gained many members from across the galaxy and was able to wield a good deal of influence and power. It was especially useful during the Thrawn campaign and the Yuuzhan Vong invasion. Coming in at number 4 is the only exclusively Old Republic crime organization, the Exchange. The Exchange was one of, if not the largest crime syndicates in the Old Republic era, with its only real rivals being those that are placed higher up on this list. The Exchange was galaxy spanning, and based on what we see in Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2, it seems like they kept a fairly major presence on most worlds. On the planets they were involved in, they typically control gambling, the trading of illegal activities, and more nefarious things like bounty hunting and assassinations. The reach and resources of the Exchange were so great that the droid boss of the Exchange's Nar Shaddaa operation, who often went by the moniker Godo, was able to effect significant societal and economic change on a stellar scale. The Exchange would be higher on this list, but sometime after Knights of the Republic 2, they became no more, whether they were disbanded, destroyed, or something else entirely. Coming in at number 3 is the Zon Consortium, a faction that first appeared in the Forces of Corruption expansion for the game Empire at War. The Consortium, as led by Tiber Zon, was most notable in my mind for its extreme military might. Zon had dreams of controlling the entire galaxy, and he constructed a fleet and ground forces which would help him do so. Although the Consortium did experience some setbacks, including when Jabba, perceiving Tiber to be a major threat to his power, had him locked up, they would also secure several major victories, most notably the capture of the under construction Eclipse-class dreadnought. Along with this dreadnought, Zon secured priceless information along with billions of credits. He would later ditch the Eclipse, and something would cause the Zon Consortium to fall. However, for a while they had a massive amount of power. Coming in at number 2 is the Hutts. Now, in reality, the Hutts were made up of many crime families, each which had their own motivations and power. However, they at times did work together, and it makes most sense to consider them as one giant criminal organization. Every single one of the groups so far had important interactions with the Hutts. The Smugglers Alliance came about because of the death of Jabba the Hutt. The exchange was likely shut down by the Hutts as they gained more power, and Tiberzon saw Jabba the Hutt as his main rival for much of his life. It's really hard to overstate just how powerful the Hutts were. They had whole sectors of space under their influence and control. Because of their vast resources, including a capable Starfleet, even the Empire avoided interfering with Hutt holdings. The cartel existed for thousands of years and engaged in almost all possible types of business activity, both legal and illegal. The Hutts are so important that with the death of Jabba, who was the leader of one of the major Hutt families, a whole new generation of smugglers and other criminals rose to prominence. Although the death of Jabba was obviously devastating for his criminal empire, the Hutts as a whole continued to operate successfully into the Yuuzhan Vong War and beyond. Coming in at number 1 is Black Sun, an organization first introduced in one of my favorite video games of all time, Shadows of the Empire. That game features then Black Sun leader Prince Xizor as he vies to replace Darth Vader as the Emperor's right-hand man. The final mission of that game is an attack on Xizor's Skyhook, a massive Black Sun space station protected by a fleet. Everything I've said so far I think should give you a good idea of just how serious this organization was. Black Sun is basically like the Exchange had the Exchange never fallen. They do literally every possible type of illegal activity and have existed uninterrupted for nearly 4,000 years. The Black Sun would have had operations on nearly every major planet in the galaxy, with most operations having their own sub-crime boss. The scale, longevity, and mix of crime performed by Black Sun is, in my opinion, unmatched within the Star Wars universe, and for that reason, I give it the number 1 spot on this list. Alright, so Boba Fett in Star Wars Legends has a fairly interesting history, as is the case with canon. Of course, falling into the Sarlacc didn't kill him. He'd be brought back very early into the revamped Star Wars Expanded Universe with Dark Empire, where, of course, he was hunting down Han Solo and seems to really dislike the guy. It is, you know, a small universe after all. However, Boba Fett was brought back more prominently for Tales of the Bounty Hunters, where we get a full short story all about Fett's history. Tales of the Bounty Hunters, by the way, is an excellent Star Wars anthology, just like Tales from Jabba's Palace, but the short story we're discussing today is specifically called The Last One Standing, The Tale of Boba Fett. The story is set out in a pretty cool way, where it sort of details several interactions between Han and Boba, who are presented as rivals, and of course ends off with the two men pointing blasters at each other. However, the thing that's most interesting for the point of this video is the fact that it dives really deeply into what Boba Fett is actually like. Not only his fictional character history, but what his personality is like, how he acts around other characters. And this probably would have been fine had Attack of the Clones not existed. I don't think anyone realized that Boba Fett would become an important character in the prequels and that his family would take on this greater role. So obviously, a lot of what was established in Last One Standing and in other early Star Wars Expanded Universe tales would end up being retconned. For example, the story for some reason establishes Boba Fett's real name as Jaster Muriel, and establishes this full story and this personality for the character. Now, some of this can be sort of retconned by making Jaster Muriel another character, but some of how Boba Fett is portrayed just doesn't really jive with his later portrayals either in the prequels, Star Wars canon, or even later Expanded Universe works where Boba Fett featured prominently, like Legacy of the Force. Probably the most enlightening section of the short story comes in a conversation between Leia and Boba during the events of Return of the Jedi. Now, I joke that Boba Fett is an incel. Obviously that's not quite right, but they give him this very strange and strict morality about sex and drugs and lots of other things, which is just kind of random considering how his character would develop later. First of all, Boba Fett says straight up in a meeting between him and Leia that sex between those not married is immoral. So I guess Boba Fett's technically not an incel because that's involuntary, so he's a volcel instead. I don't know, we're stretching the limits of internet lingo here. I also just do think it's kind of funny because one of the things we explicitly see in Return of the Jedi, one of the few scenes of Boba Fett, is him talking sort of flirtatiously with a woman, but whatever. But then we also get another paragraph where it says, Fett approved of Leia's modesty, but it did not prevent him from continuing to look at her. He had never so much as held a woman in his arms, Boba Fett, and the desire for a woman came to him less frequently with the passage of the years. So I believe what Boba Fett has achieved is, like, I think they call it wizard status. And obviously I'm joking around a bit, it's totally fine to practice chastity or whatever else, and there's also good things, objectively good things about Boba Fett and this sort of morality. First of all, he has no interest at all in hurting Leia, and his sense of morality is probably instilled from his time as a journeyman protector. In that role, he's all about dispensing justice and is even willing to do so extrajudicially. The story also paints Boba Fett as serving the Empire not only because they pay extraordinarily well, but also because he saw the rebels as morally wrong. He says those worlds rose in rebellion against the authority legally in place over them when talking about Alderaan and other planets. The Emperor was within his rights to destroy them. They threatened the system of social justice that permits civilization to exist. I'm sorry for the deaths of the innocent, but that happens in war. So he's not only got this weird sexual morality, but he's also a bit of an authoritarian. Boba Fett is also not down for partying because we learn in this part of the story that one of the reasons why he hates Han Solo so much is because he smuggles spice. Spice is illegal, it's a euphoric, it alters moods, and the use of it leads to the use of worse substances, and a man who will run spice, Boba snarled, will run anything. And if I had been using spice tonight, Leia Organa, perhaps you'd not be safe with me here in this room. And the fact that makes all of this kind of stranger and makes Boba's character even sadder, I guess, is the fact that this is the first time he spoke to anyone when he has this conversation with Leia in a very long time. Even just letting out these few sentences has started to hurt his throat. So yeah, that's how Boba Fett was envisioned, this very staunch, very strict person with an unshakable morality who thinks the Empire is right. And to be honest, I am happy this is not what Disney and what the rest of the expanded universe chose to go with when shaping Boba Fett's character later on. I mean, some of it's interesting, but I much prefer the idea that Boba Fett is just self-serving, and perhaps, as we see in Star Wars Legends and also The Mandalorian, even loyal, because it's sort of contrasting with his general character. But yeah, I still highly recommend you guys read all of Tales of the Bounty Hunters. It's a very fun read. I love those anthology stories, and they were written very early on in the Star Wars Expanded Universe, so it's interesting to see how things change from their original conception to later on. When I saw the post-credit scene for the Mandalorian 2 season finale, the main question in my head was, what is the Book of Boba Fett? Is that going to be a replacement for the Mandalorian season 3? Is it a brand new show? And the answer to that seems to be, well, somewhere in between, but it seems like the question a lot of other people had is, how did Bib Fortuna survive the explosion on Jabba's sail barge? And yeah, I didn't even think about that, but you can see Bib Fortuna on Jabba's barge before it explodes. Obviously, there's not a whole lot around the Great Pit of Carkoon, which is in the middle of the Dune Sea, but nonetheless, clearly Bib Fortuna survived and managed to secure the throne of Jabba the Hutt and the reins of his criminal empire. How did that happen? Well, right now all we can do is guess, but a lot of what we've seen so far about Bib Fortuna indicates that his Star Wars canon story may be very familiar, if not the exact same, to what happened in Star Wars Legends. So we're going to speculate based on that Legends information, and I think the best way to do that is actually examine the source of Fortuna's post-Return of the Jedi lore, and that comes from the short story of The Day's Annoyances, Bib Fortuna's Tale, which comes itself from the excellent Legends anthology book Tales from Jabba's Palace, which I've talked about many times on the channel in the past. I say post-Return of the Jedi lore, but really we only get a few hours, maybe up to a day, of Bib Fortuna's life from the last time we see him. Most of the short story is based around the days and months leading up to the events of episode 6. I'll explain all of that in a moment, but the short version is that Bib Fortuna escaped Jabba's sail barge through the use of a secret private skiff which he had on board because he was planning planning to overthrow the crime lord anyway. And again, keeping it short, that's pretty simple, and that's what I expect Star Wars canon to use for its explanation as well. I mean, Bib Fortuna is portrayed as sort of conniving, and the fact that he manages right away to secure this power vacuum, I think, speaks to how motivated and sneaky and driven he is. And I mean, a life around Jabba and the people that he spends his time with will do that to you. But let's talk about the long story from the aforementioned Bib Fortuna legend short story, because I think it's quite interesting. So, Bib Fortuna had been planning the murder of Jabba for some time, and as his major domo, he'd been making moves behind the scene to secure a clean transition of power. He had been getting access to Jabba's bank accounts, working with Jabba's connections within and without the palace, identifying risks to Jabba and to Jabba's palace, risks that he would have to deal with when he took the throne, and perhaps most interestingly, working with the Bomar monks. The Bomar monks were the beings who originally created Jabba's palace. The order is most well known for the ultimate stage of enlightenment for individual monks, where their brains are taken out, put into a nutrient vat, and carried around on spiders. That way they can, according to the short story, contemplate the mysteries of the universe without the distractions of the physical world. So you're literally a brain in a vat. Usually you don't even have external stimuli, although you can turn that on through the droid, and you're just thinking there. Often brains would go insane if they weren't prepared, which is why this only happened after monks had achieved some stage of enlightenment. Anyway, Bib Fortuna is cruel like Jabba, and he intends to maintain much of Jabba's criminal enterprise, even the seedy bits like selling slaves, but he honestly thinks he can do so more intelligently. He thinks Jabba's laxed in many concerns, and that his empire has started to fall into a bit of disrepute, which is interesting for a reason I'll talk about later. Anyway, Bib planned a violent coup against Jabba. There were several different ways which he could have killed him, and the idea was he'd kill him, he'd immediately seize Jabba's bank accounts and his assets, and the Bomar monks would help to secure the palace itself. As Bib Fortuna worked with the monks, he also had this feeling that he was gaining some form of enlightenment, that he was beginning to see sort of the current of the universe, and that he could predict things, almost like a force power. Although, as we learn at the end of the story, he really only had a very small taste of that, and in reality it was more of an illusion than anything else. Bib had ambitions beyond Jabba's palace though. I think his ultimate goal was to secure control of Ryloth, the planet of the Twi'leks, and there's a whole subplot about that in the story, but not really relevant for the purposes of today's video. Anyway, in the days leading up to Return of the Jedi, Bib is contacted by Luke Skywalker, who asks to let Han Solo free. This is not the scene in Jabba's palace, this is before, and Mos Eisley, Bib says no, but he also recognizes that the rebellion has their eyes on Jabba now and has integrated members of the Alliance into Jabba's cadre. Not only Leia, who is, well, obviously Leia, but he also knows Lando's there, he also knows R2-D2's there. He's not familiar, however, with C-3PO. Another interesting development is the fact that Bib Fortuna actually takes the thermal detonator that Leia has when she threatens Jabba under disguise, and he uses that as the building blocks for the plan, which would see Jabba's death finally happen. His timeline is pushed forward by his embarrassment by Luke Skywalker, who of course uses a mind trick on him. He realizes that Jabba can't be allowed to live anymore, and he can't suffer this humiliation as a major domo if he does want to secure power later. But at this point, there are also multiple other plans underway to kill Jabba. There is poisoned food, which Jabba actually does eat on the day of the sail barge. Apparently half the drinks being served by R2 were poisoned, and of course there was the whole rebel situation, sort of culminating in the fact that Jabba was definitely not making it off that sail barge regardless of how things went down with the Pit of Carkoon, and that is why Bib Fortuna brought his skiff. The sail barge events had the effect of not only taking Jabba away from the palace, but also leaving the palace fairly empty. So Fortuna's plan was just to sneak away, get back to the palace with Jabba now either dead or dying, and with the help of the Bomar monks, secure power. Exactly how this happened in Star Wars canon, we don't know, but presumably something like this. Either way, what happened in Legends is that Bib Fortuna got away, he got back to the palace and was betrayed by the Bomar monks, who who, instead of helping him secure the palace and start the reign of his new empire, instead removed his brain and placed it in a new droid body. The short story actually ends shortly before that point, with Fortuna deciding not to kill himself and instead move on to this next phase of his life. But I do think it's interesting because instead in canon we get a successful coup, and I do believe this was a coup because I don't think there's any other way that Bib Fortuna, of all people, the relatively quiet and although scheming, inconsequential servant of Jabba, could have secured power. He definitely had connections. He was probably working towards this himself, but we see by the time of The Mandalorian that he's fallen into the same excesses that Jabba has. His palace isn't well protected. Boba Fett kind of just strolls in and, with the help of Fennec Shand, secures that bag. He's also literally become fat and vulnerable like Jabba, so interesting how in canon, although the Legends character had all of these ideas, those certainly haven't played out. So with the Book of Boba Fett just weeks away, I thought now would be a good time to take a close look at Boba's mighty steed, his starship Slave 1. So today we'll examine how that ship works, what makes it tick, how good it is, and what you can expect to see it do in the Book of Boba Fett. So Slave 1 is a Firespray 31 class attack craft. It is of course the same ship his father used, and of course, it served him well throughout his bounty hunting career. Before you ask, no, we don't know what happened to Slave 1 while Boba Fett was taking a Sarlacc bath. Presumably that's something we'll learn in the series. The new Essential Guide to Vehicles and Vessels has a ton of information about Slave 1. Now technically it is a Star Wars Legends source, but I haven't seen anything to suggest that Disney will be moving away from any of the established lore. In fact, even some of the lesser well-known elements have been preserved. For example, the fact that Jango Fett acquired the ship during a prison escape, and a prison escape is actually somewhere you'd expect to see this type of ship because the fire spray was often used by law enforcement. However, the ship would not remain in its stock state for very long because upon taking control of the craft, Jango Fett, unsurprisingly, began making some extreme and very illegal modifications. The most drastic changes came in weaponry, and this is something we've already seen play out in The Mandalorian. The fire spray already contains twin blaster cannons, which is already quite a lot for a non-military use ship. Jango Fett upgraded these with a much better targeting computer and also added secondary quick firing laser cannons. And this is what we see harassing Obi-Wan Kenobi during their battle at Geonosis. These things were not very powerful, they were not very accurate, but they could be fired nearly continuously and could certainly take out all but the most skilled opponent. Additionally, he added the famous mine layer, which yes, could drop seismic charges, but presumably also other armament. Now this isn't something we've actually seen, and I don't think this ever occurred in Star Wars Legends even, but there's no reason that Boba Fett couldn't swap out the seismic charge with maybe an ion pulse weapon so he could disable ships and take their crew. Or he could even get creative and drop a smoke screen or some sort of sensor scrambler, whatever. Additionally, we also know that Slave 1 had a torpedo launcher, making it extraordinarily deadly in a dogfight. In fact, for its size, I would wager that Slave 1 is probably one of the most deadly starfighters in single combat. That being said, it does have a few obvious flaws. If you can get behind the ship, it offers a very big target profile. The engines are, well, quite wide. But I mean, if we start rating Star Wars ships on their target profile, well, it's not going to be a good day to be most pilots. Anyway, when it comes to dogfighting, the Starships of the Galaxy Guide also points out that extensive and very expensive engine modifications allowed the vessel to compete even with nimble snub fighters. Advanced onboard computer systems also made the already potent weapons even more dangerous. Let's actually stick to computer systems and move away from some of the purely offensive features of the vessel. Based on the cross-section for Slave 1, it seems like Jango Fett really went out of his way to add the most expensive heavy-duty version of any sensor and computer system he could find into the craft, which is one thing that actually makes Slave 1's pretty large size a bonus. Aside from heavy-duty shield generators like, say, the Millennium Falcon, the Slave 1 had, and I quote from the incredible cross-sections, stolen military sensor jamming and masking devices, enabling Slave 1 to disappear from most scanning systems. And this generally played well into Slave One's appearance, although of course the vessel was famous because of its association with Boba Fett. There were certainly some people who would see it and assume that it was an unmodified fire spray, and we do know from the Saga Edition Starships of the Galaxy guide that fire spray blueprints made their way out into the criminal underworld, so the ships were being built sometimes on the black market and were also being sold out of service. The jamming system and the fact that most of the improvements are under the ship's skin or can be hidden, like with the blaster cannon, makes this a fairly deceptive vessel. The final thing I want to talk about is the ship's original purpose as a prison ship. Of course, that served Boba Fett very well. The ship was large and, like the Razor Crest, had room for several prisoners, including one later modified by Boba Fett to even capture Jedi or other Force sensitives. Additionally, the vessel did have quarters for sleeping and storage, so it's not unlikely that we may see Boba Fett go on some longer journeys. Alright, with the basics laid out, what does that tell us about the ship and how it may be used in the Book of Boba Fett? Well, as I just mentioned, the ship is very capable of traveling between star systems and can also hold itself up to basically any enemy. That's different than we saw with the Razor Crest. Din Djarin was almost always disadvantaged when in space combat. His ship was just not built for it. Slave One is. The thing can take a shot because of its very powerful shield generators, and it can hit back in 3 or 4 different ways. But Slave One has options other than fighting, as we've discussed. If Boba Fett wants to hide, he has the ability to do so. And I mean, this is even something we see on screen in The Empire Strikes Back. He tracks the Millennium Falcon, stays hidden against a ship that we know itself is very heavily modified. So that's a lot more freedom for Boba Fett. I'm not sure how much he will be moving off Tatooine, but if he wants to, he'll certainly be able to. I also wouldn't be surprised if we see Boba Fett further modify the ship. I think this will be less disposable than the Razor's Crest. I think, for example, I was about to say that we'll see him add on some ion cannons, then I remembered he actually already has some, as we see at the end of The Mandalorian Season 2. But yeah, that scene gives a good look at the Slave One's versatility and the fact that it can even hunt down relatively large ships. Lambdas don't usually have guns, sometimes they have rear-facing weapons, but still. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this topic. I think it was a pretty interesting one. Is there anything else you'd like me to cover before the Book of Boba Fett? I think these videos are somewhat fun because we can come back later and just laugh at me for being confidently wrong. Obviously, one of the most interesting moments in The Empire Strikes Back is the bounty hunter scene. On the Executor, we see Darth Vader, to the chagrin of the Imperial command staff on scene, communicating with bounty hunters who are being hired to search for Han Solo. And I mean, this scene is so interesting because it was basically George Lucas and ILM's opportunity to create 5 unique designs which didn't have to be tied to any existing aesthetic sense. It was essentially a brief look at the larger galaxy and a story which is ultimately, up to that point, fairly contained, and that's why I love it so much and why I think generally people have become so attached to these characters. On that note, I actually think it was a mistake to make the bounty hunters shown here be basically the bounty hunters across the entire galaxy. I think it removes some of the mystique of the Star Wars world building. It's a lot more interesting if Darth Vader just called whoever was in the neighborhood and he got this weird collection of characters. That's sort of generally a problem with Star Wars. Han Solo is the smuggler, Jabba is the gangster, these are the bounty hunters. But it's how it turned out, and I mean, George Lucas in shows like the Clone Wars had no small part in that. But as I mentioned, we are talking today about Houndstooth. That is the ship of Bossk, not Houndstooth, the design on the shirt Ricky from Trailer Park Boys wears. No, Houndstooth is a 62-meter long modified YV-666 light freighter. In my mind, this is almost the perfect smuggler ship. It's also, for anyone who's played Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes, an absolute bastard on defense. But I mean, I think people probably aren't properly conceptualizing just how large this ship is. The Millennium Falcon, for example, itself quite a large vehicle, is 34 meters long. This is almost twice that. It's comparable to a Boeing Dreamlifter. That's a really big aircraft. It's thus fairly remarkable that Bossk is able to operate this entire ship all by himself. But unsurprisingly, according to the new Essential Guide to Vehicles and Vessels, it's really a phenomenal bounty hunting vessel. Bossk is often the only living being on the ship, but he also has installed an X-10D droid brain. This allows him to not only control the ship from outside, allowing it to operate independently, but within the ship, he can call out and have the brain perform pretty much any function he wants. The Houndstooth is quite an interesting design. You may not be able to tell from its appearance, but this is in fact a Corellian Engineering Corporation ship. That meant, despite its somewhat blocky and honestly standardized looking outside appearance, it was heavily modifiable, with bounty hunters like Bossk not only changing the internal weapons and engine systems, but also the configuration of rooms, which there were many of given this ship's vast space, including 3 decks with the bottom mostly being dedicated to ship systems. The wings on the back, by the way, those are maneuvering fins. Why a spaceship needs maneuvering fins, I'm not sure. However, they can be pulled up when the vessel is landing. According to the new Essential Guide to Vehicles and Vessels, Bossk had his ship modified to contain the following: private quarters, a training room, an armory, an advanced medical bay, with the aft section being converted to a prison with several magnetically reinforced holding cells. These cages are connected to a force field generator activated by motion sensors in the event of a breakout, and it also has a skinning table, interrogation devices, and of course, knowing that Bossk is a Trandoshan, his trophy collection. A lot of this sounds quite similar to the setup that Boba Fett had in Slave 1 during his bounty hunting days, just significantly larger, and that's one of the things I really like about Houndstooth. It would honestly be perfect even for a small outfit, almost like a smaller and probably more effective action transport. Also, like Slave 1, Bossk liked to keep his shit locked down. He could monitor everything going on from the cockpit and had a variety of advanced security systems, making intrusion or escape essentially impossible. When it comes to combat, obviously this thing was not moving like a starfighter, although there are 2 caveats for that. For one, the Houndstooth did actually have an onboard scout ship. It was called the Nashta Pup. It was a Z-95 headhunter, and it was carried within the Houndstooth's cargo bay. Again, this is a very large ship. Personally, I would have upgraded to something maybe a bit more modern, but I like the idea of having the droid brain on ship and also the Nashta Pup in case you want to go 2-on-1 with an enemy, although that would only be in pretty dire circumstances because it's almost certain that the Houndstooth is going to be significantly more durable than a Z-95. As I mentioned, this is a large vessel. The entire lower decks are dedicated to ship systems. Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes is anything to go off of. The shield on this thing would have been quite impressive. I mentioned that the maneuverability probably wasn't great considering its size, but again, looking at the new Essential Guide to Vehicles and Vessels, it says, and I quote, "The Houndstooth's propulsion system is simple in design, but provides a great deal of maneuverability despite the starship's size. Thrust is generated by standard ion engines. Long maneuvering fins connected to the engine block allow vertical movement, while 2 main drive nozzles located between the fins control turning." Again, how the maneuvering fins really do anything in space, I don't know. This ship, at least in its current configuration, definitely wasn't the offensive juggernaut of other vessels, at least of its size, but it did have 2 retractable quad cannons, one which fired lasers, the other ion blasts. I actually like that, especially for a bounty hunter. It gives the ability to disable other ships. I always just feel like there's no possible way retractable weapons have the same sort of power as a full cannon. Like, I think of the Millennium Falcon's retractable turret versus its main quad laser cannon. Obviously, that is only a single turret, but I don't know, it's definitely something I could be wrong about. The guide does say that it can rip through most starfighters. Additionally, the Houndstooth did have a concussion missile launcher. It says that that was for fighting battleships, but if you're going to fight a battleship, you probably don't want to be in a relatively slow freighter. You want to be in something that's just specced out to the nines, like the Millennium Falcon. You want to be in another large capital ship, or you want to be in a small starfighter, which can avoid the laser cannons. The Houndstooth is like the last thing you'd want to use. The size isn't a benefit in this arena, although it is obviously for most other forms of bounty hunting. It definitely reminds me both in layout and sort of overall design of the Razor Crest, although again, that ship was significantly smaller. The Razor Crest comes in at under half the size of the Houndstooth. In Legends, the Houndstooth's most prominent appearance is probably in Bossk's story within Tales of the Bounty Hunter. There, the ship is held up as fairly threatening. One interesting fact, though, is that Bossk has a hard time with the ship, even Even with a XD-10 unit, Trandoshans have weird hands. The ships underwent modifications to fit him better, but it's still not great. Nonetheless, he is deeply, deeply attached and connected to the ship, which, I mean, makes sense given how Trandoshans are and how it's a tool of his hunt. On one occasion, after escaping the Sarlacc, Boba Fett actually stole the Houndstooth. It was also quite famously used by Bossk to transport Wookiees from Kashyyyk into Imperial slave trade. And one detail I like is that it's just generally seen as being very stinky. Season 3 of The Mandalorian has introduced a ship which I really love, the Cumulus class Corsair. This was, of course, the warship used by Pirate King Gorian Shard, which we saw taken down at the end of the most recent Mando episode. But there's actually a lot to dissect when it comes to this ship, and that's what we'll be doing in today's video. But let's start with the basics. The name, Cumulus class Corsair. In the real world, Cumulus, it's a type of cloud, and that could indicate that the Corsair is actually optimized to work in atmosphere. So that's Cumulus, but Corsair. This actually gives us even more things to talk about. A Corsair in the real world, and presumably in Star Wars, is basically a piracy vessel. That's really interesting because it means either there's some ship maker building ships specifically for pirates, or perhaps this specific modification is so common that it's been given a specific designation. I'm thinking, for example, like the New Republic Assault Frigate, which was, of course, a modified dreadnought. In this episode, we did have hints of a greater pirate nation, so it is possible that these guys are pumping out their own ships. I've got to say, I was pretty much assuming that this was a repurposed ship. At first, I thought Imperial because of the look of the exterior bridge. However, we got a better look at the inside of the bridge this episode, and I don't know, something about it to me just screamed CIS. I think it's these monitors especially, but that was just a feeling. I will say the sort of internal ship launching system would have also worked very, very well with droid starfighters, which in Revenge of the Sith we see often just clamber across the surface of their ships. That, however, is just pure speculation, and I guess it's more likely that this is a new class of ship. But let's talk more about what she's sporting, because we get a better look at the Corsair in this episode as the Mandalorian and Bo-Katan take it apart piece by piece. First, the weaponry, and this is pretty interesting. The Corsair has 4 quick-firing quad laser cannons on the top side of the ship. On the bottom, we see 14, which is actually more than I expected, double turrets, which obviously can extend from the ship's bellies, almost like gunwells on an old pirate ship. This setup to me actually further cemented the idea that this could be a specifically designed piracy vessel made to operate in atmosphere, because it's perfect for what Gorian Shard does here. Basically bullying planets which don't have the resources to fight back. You can bombard the citizens with your slow-moving, heavier cannons, and they are slow-moving, I'll get back to that, while you defend from real threats, i.e. any incoming aiding starfighters with the quicker quad laser cannons. But yeah, those turrets on the bottom, they're slow. In this episode, we see them fail to track the Mandalorian. It also appears that they may have a variable loadout. In episode 1, we see very briefly one firing a traditional laser, while in this episode, they're bombarding the city with probably unguided rockets, but perhaps some other form of projectile. This could be like a mass driver or something, which is just shooting a projectile very, very quickly, a sort of basic weapon. It makes sense if Gorian Shard knew that they were going to bully a city instead of, fly around and engage opponents in space, that he'd have them switch to this more destructive weapon. Overall, though, I think the way the turrets roll out is very interesting and very clever, especially for a pirate ship, which is probably trying to hide the full extent of its firepower when under scrutiny. When it comes to size, I would guess the ship is probably about 150 meters long. It does, however, manage to carry 12, albeit small, starfighters. We don't know the exact model of these. So far in show, they've only been referred to as snub fighters or pirate snub fighters. That's when listening to the descriptive audio. My guess, as I mentioned, is that it's some form of Star Chaser that was a legend ship, and their performance generally would match that. They have almost nothing in the way of shields. They're pretty fast and flitty, but certainly no match for a true highly powered starfighter like the N1. I also get the feeling that the Corsair is not the most advanced ship in its own right. It does have shields, we hear from the bridge crew, but they're constantly being overwhelmed by even the Mandalorian's laser fire. On a really big warship like a Star Destroyer, you'd probably have dedicated shield projectors, and most likely you're not going to seriously damage components until you're popping through the shields itself. In this case, the shields are still standing, but most likely they're being overwhelmed because of, only a few shield projectors, not enough power. Thus, the Mandalorian is getting through and even disabling weapons. It makes sense. This thing is a Corsair. It's going to be picking its targets and feasting on the vulnerable. It's not expecting to come across highly organized resistance or even just two very powerful starfighters. Then obviously it's taken down because of the loss of presumably its engines and its repulsor lift generators. We actually see that Bo-Katan is firing missiles or rockets at the ship alongside lasers, which I thought it was a nice touch. And of course, while it crashes, it does have that SSD sound from Return of the Jedi. I didn't really find much else about the Corsair. I looked online, there was some stuff Ryan Church posted, mostly about the paint scheme. He said that the original design was made first, the paint was added after, and he also made a post about the paint schemes on CIS ships in the Revenge of the Sith, maybe indicating that the Corsair could be of that vintage, but I'm not sure. Overall though, I said this in my review, I thought these scenes looked amazing. I don't know if it's the lighting or what, but they've really nailed how ships should look, especially in atmosphere like this. So I'm very excited to see hopefully more in terms of space combat in the rest of The Mandalorian Season 3 and certainly moving forward. Ugly Starfighters are known across the galaxy for being, well, pretty crappy. They're essentially bits and pieces of different fighters thrown together in desperation when an entire working ship isn't otherwise available. So maybe you've got a pilot of TIE fighter wings scrapped from crashed fighters, then a few X-wings or Y-wing fuselages, add some glue, and baby, you got yourself a stew going. It's pretty clear why this didn't work out very well. You're taking ships with different purposes and specializations, and basically jerry-rigging a Frankenstein machine, usually complete with major performance loss and maintenance issues. In fact, the ugly known as the TIE Wing is probably the worst starfighter of all time, combining the ball cockpit and weapons of a TIE with the engines of a Y-Wing, essentially taking the two worst aspects of both. So you have the Y-Wing's poor speed and maneuverability with the poor shielding and armaments of the TIE. It's a death box that should literally only be used when nothing else is available, and maybe even not then. However, not all uglies were so terrible. The Death Raven, for example, was basically two B-Wings strapped together, but ended up being more of a freighter rather than a fighter, and there are other examples of ships that worked just fine. Still, good or bad, uglies were generally only used when a faction could not afford to either buy new or used fighters off the market or produce their own. The best, or at least most functional uglies were those designed with the uniformity, purpose, and knowledge of the key aspects of the constituent fighters. So if you're having a ship based off the Y-Wing, you want one that doesn't need speed. If you're starting from an unshielded TIE fighter, then maintaining maneuverability is probably going to be key. With all that being said, in my opinion, the best Star Wars ugly starfighter was the Twi'lek Cherdaki. Now, there were never any official pictures of this craft, so you'll have to use the power of imagination. Still, I'll try to paint a picture. The Cherdaki was an incredibly unique and surprisingly useful ugly. Invented sometime during the Galactic Civil War, and perhaps after Endor, the Cherdaki was a Twi'lek fighter built on Ryloth and perhaps other planets. Its first known exposure to the rest of the galaxy was in 7 ABY, when Wedge Antilles and other Rogue Squadron members liaised with the Twi'lek. Here's Wedge's first impression of the craft and a general description of the ugly from the Krytos trap. In 3 pairs came a half-dozen uglies. The X-Wing fighter's distinctive S-foils jutted out from the sides of a TIE fighter's ball cockpit. The stabilizers had been fastened to a collar that surrounded the cockpit, and as the fighters maneuvered and cavorted in the air above the assembly, he saw the S-foils rotating around the cockpit, making the design similar in principle to that of the B-Wing fighter in service with the Alliance. So if you couldn't tell from the brief description there, their Cherdaki is pretty weird. But what's more, it strains the definition of what can be considered an ugly. Although it's mostly made up of the main body of a TIE fighter and the wings of an X-Wing, it also used a new standardized part, the sort of connective collar. And what's more, all Chewbacca's were of completely uniform design with little to no part deviation. So essentially you have a ball cockpit, a collar surrounding it, then wings which can rotate freely around and open and close like normal S-foils. And I'll include some fan artwork with credit to all down in the description. The collar is actually, in my opinion, the most interesting part. Not only could the wings fully rotate around a stationary cockpit, but other systems including landing gear were also included within, giving the fighter a bit more functionality. Another interesting feature of this ugly was the way it used redundant systems. The TIE's powerful ion engines propelled the craft, while the engines of the X-Wing, which remember are situated on the S-foils, were used to power shields, hyperdrive, and other weapons, essentially adding extra power to the base TIE design. And yes, you heard me correctly, this fighter did have a hyperdrive, unlike the base TIE, although it did not have any sort of life support, so pilots were required to be in an enclosed vac suit. The collar gave the fighter extra maneuverability and stability, while also helping with laser targeting, and even Wedge could not help but be impressed upon seeing the Tridaki. The Twi'lek agreed, with the name of the fighter actually translating to Death Seed in BASIC. The Death Seed are the Drock from Nam Chorios, and were named as such because, and I quote, "it recalls the spores of a parasitic fungus that invades a larger creature and destroys it. Most unpleasant, as would be facing our Tridaki in combat." The major weakness of the ship was the lack of torpedo launchers, limiting the Tridaki in both anti-starfighter and anti-capital ship combat. However, the TIE cockpit does not have launchers, and on the X-Wing they are connected to the fuselage rather than the wings, thus it would be too expensive to independently both secure the launcher apparatuses and the munitions itself. And with that kind of cost, you're sort of defeating the point of an ugly in the first place. This, however, worked perfectly for Rogue Squadron, who took on at least one squad of Death Seeds and their Twi'lek pilots during the Bacta War, and that's because they were already extremely limited on funds and were having a tough time replacing ordnance, so they probably couldn't have afforded to arm the launchers even if they did exist. More on that point, Tridaki were loaned to Rogue Squadron during the Bacta War as a way to help prove the Twi'lek as a fighting force. They were led by the warrior pilot Taldria, and although they lacked missiles, they were useful in both space combat and ground raids, including the attack on Crew 25 and the capture of the Lusankya. They were instrumental as well in assisting with the destruction of the Corruptor Victory Star Destroyer, providing cover for the X-Wings of Rogue Squadron, and were just generally very effective fighters. They never seemed like a burden and always kept up with the Rogues, which is very impressive given the fact, again, that these are hobbled together fighters. That being said, their pilots generally did take more casualties. As a brief recap, Tridaki were shielded, decently well armed, and even more maneuverable than a TIE fighter. They were, however, slower. One thing to note is that it seems like the TIE's internal power supply drove the engines, which perhaps means that a pilot is unable to shift energy between the X-Wing powered components like the energy and shields to the engines, although it's possible that there is some sort of connected internal system. This tactic of power shift specifically between the lasers, shield, and engines was a key tactic vital to many New Republic starfighters, and gave the craft some extra versatility and adaptability. Another question I have is, why didn't the starfighter also use the two cannons on the TIE? My guess is that they were seen as redundant, and all available power was instead sent to the engines. Deep in the bowels of Jabba's foul palace lies a secret almost too disturbing to utter. A secret that will change not only how you see Return of the Jedi, but Star Wars as a whole. Jabba's entourage was made up of hundreds of aliens. One in particular is the focus of today's video, and anyone who knows Jabba knows his fondness for jizz wailing, one of the galaxy's most popular musical styles. He loved jizz so much that he hired a band as live-in entertainers. I'm talking, of course, about the wonderful Max Rebo Band. By the time of Return of the Jedi, the group was made up of 12 members, including, of course, Max Rebo himself. Personally, I prefer Droopy McCool, but Max was deservedly the star. As a kid, I didn't know Max's name. I just called him the Blue Elephant, like I think most of us did. I thought he was a cute little fella sitting behind a keyboard, rocking out for a giant slug. Honestly, I wish I could go back to those childhood days, and it wasn't until much later that I discovered the horrifying truth. You see, those appendages that Max uses to play his keyboard aren't arms. They're legs. Toy companies and the writers of the old expanded universe realized that we weren't ready for the truth, so played to the fantasy that many of us believed, that Max was an ordinary, upright walking blue elephant who just happened to be sitting behind a keyboard. But, as Pablo Hidalgo explains in the StarWars.com article, Getting to the Bottom of Max Rebo, the original designers actually sculpted Max as sitting, as we can see in these grotesque pictures, which show, and excuse my foul language, a butt. Another horrifying image shows that Max is not behind a padded ledge on his keyboard, like I always assumed. He's actually sitting on a cushion, legs splayed out for the world to see, feet playing the keyboard. Once you realize this inescapable truth, it's never possible to look at Max, Return of the Jedi, or even Star Wars the same way ever again. Honestly, I don't think children should be exposed to this, and I'm very, very uncomfortable by the fact that the new canon doesn't even attempt to hide Max's strange body. New reference books have made clear that Ortolans only possess 2 limbs, and disturbing imagery has even made its way to non-canon comic books. Anyway, that's all I have for today's expose. When I hear more information, you guys will be the first to know. Now, guys, please be safe out there, and of course, may the Force be with you.